Assalamualaikum everyone, welcome back to the Muslim Mental Health Podcast. Today we have Saima and Sumaiyah back on our episode. So because this is a part 2 to our Inside the Anxious Mind episodes, Sumaiyah, do you want to go over our past episode prior to this one?
Yeah. So in our past episode, Inside the Anxious Mind, part 1, we kind of discussed anxiety as a spectrum, right? The spectrum being quite vast. So we discussed how anxiety essentially impacts functioning, right? And so on one side of the spectrum, we have anxiety that impacts daily functioning, meaning, your ability to go to work, relationships, appetite, sleep, things like that, some of the physical manifestations of anxiety, right? And then on the other side of the spectrum, so to speak, we have anxiety almost just as an emotion, something that is a part of each and every single one of us, and something that we experience due to different life changes, due to working with different types of people, different phases in our life, whatever it might be. And so in Inside the Anxious Mind Part 1, we just discussed that anxiety is a spectrum, right? And you might fall somewhere on either side or in between, and how you might react to those things, how it might manifest in your body, things like that. And so if you're interested in kind of looking at the clinical side of things or how it might manifest in that way, then we would definitely recommend to check out Inside the Anxious Mind Part 1. Mm-hmm. And today we're kind of going to be discussing how it manifests relationally. And we're going to kind of get into it there.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, like Sumaiyah said, definitely check out our past episode if you're able to. But today in particular, we're going to be talking about like intergenerational anxiety, how anxiety manifests differently in different generations. So a more in-depth definition, Saima, Saima, do you mind going over what intergenerational anxiety is?
Of course. So intergenerational anxiety, or really intergenerational anything, any kind of mental health issue or any kind of environmental issue, is really about how this particular issue is kind of passed down from one generation to the next, right? Whether it be it doesn't really have to be just our parents to children. It could go way, way, way further back than that into our ancestors. But with intergenerational anxiety, what we're going to be talking about here is how the effects of anxiety, how they affected our ancestors, how that got passed down to each generation. So for example, I think the perfect example that comes to my mind is, immigrant parents and first generation or second generation immigrant children here in America, right? Navigating through all of that. So anxiety, like Sumaiyah mentioned, it's a very large spectrum, right? We know anxiety is an emotion. We know it's the fear of uncertainty. We know there are physical symptoms, there are mental symptoms, there's emotional symptoms. So how our parents' generation responded to the anxiety, to that fear of uncertainty they were feeling at the time, how they responded to that, and how the children perceived that is what is passed down, right? So for example, let's say coming to a new country, building a life here can come with a lot of uncertainty, right? There's fear there's paranoia, there's hypervigilance. And now as parents that are raising their children in a foreign country, that's going to put a lot of responsibility on them, and they might not be able to provide what we now say that a child necessarily needs, right? So let's say that the way they responded to that uncertainty could be through, maybe being emotionally absent, maybe just being more protective, more hypervigilant, more paranoid as a parent, and then that gets translated and perceived by that child as, oh, I was neglected, or I have very strict parents, mm-hmm. and that child may respond to those things very differently as an adult, maybe in a rebellious manner. Maybe they might not know how to be emotional because that emotional culture wasn't really nurtured or in a way within the household. So they may grow up not really knowing how to express themselves. They may not know how to be to have emotional conversations with their friends, with their teachers, if they're married, with their spouses, or with their children when they have children. Mm-hmm. So that's that intergenerational piece where it's like something that was missing, that was something that was absent in our parents' generation. If it is still absent as an adult, as a child, and we don't address it, then it continues. That cycle just continues, and it continues to be absent in our household, and so on and so forth, until I guess that nowadays they say the cycle breakers, until they make an appearance really and break that cycle, which is easier said than done.
Thanks for sharing, Saima. Yeah, so in my head, like generational experiences are so different. Like you mentioned, like a lot of our parents have moved across the country or like to a different country. They have to raise kids here. They have to like adapt to a new life in a sense. And on top of that, like they, on the flip side, actually, like us, like a generation where our parents might have like been born in a different country, but we're born and raised here, we might have different like stressors, such as like our career aspects or making our parents proud, or like the hustle culture of like this world. So all to say that different generations have such different experiences that may impact their causes of what their anxiety is. So as adult children of immigrants or immigrant parents, how can we bridge the gap of understanding each other's anxiousness?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that it kind of starts with exactly how you put it, right? Understanding the different experiences that each generation has. Now, all you can do is do your best to try to empathize with it, right? Because you weren't there. Those are their lived experiences, just like we have our lived experiences. And I think oftentimes the mismatch almost, or the misattunement, comes when each generation kind of expects things that the other might not be able to give them, right? That empathy or that compassion might be lacking just a little bit. And so when we're looking at trying to bridge the gap, the first step I would think of is being able to listen to understand, listen to empathize with the other, group, right? Parents listening to empathize with their children and vice versa, instead of having these almost like unrealistic expectations based on your lived experience that you kind of want to apply to another group of people who doesn't have the same lived experience, right? Again, it's a mismatch, and what it's going to do is leave one group almost feeling dissatisfied, not heard, not having their needs met, because you're not really attuning to them, right? And so really just leaning into trying to understand, trying to put yourself in their shoes, trying to do that so that you can work towards bridging that divide, right? Instead of just kind of filling it in with what you feel like needs to happen. Right. That's kind of where my mind goes.
Yeah, and it just makes me think, like nowadays when we're trying to have a conversation about anxiety, yes, but even mental health in general, it is perceived as such a contemporary concept. It's like, oh no, it's almost like millennials and Gen Z have created mental health issues, have created this term anxiety, but that's far from the truth, right? Mental health issues have been there since the beginning of time, and anxiety has been there since the beginning of time. It's just maybe terminology was different. Maybe those lived experiences were different, right? Like for older generations, instead of the term anxiety, maybe they would relate to terms such as restlessness, such as worry, such as brain fog, such as tightness in the chest, such as headaches. Any of these symptoms of anxiety, they may be able to relate to compared to, the term anxiety that we use now. And it just kind of goes back to, bridging that gap really goes back to how we spread that awareness. Because you can only teach someone who's willing to learn, one, and two, if they are willing to learn, we have to reframe the content in a way where they're able to digest that content. Mm-hmm. So the way we digest content is going to be very different than the way they digest content. And I mean, I think a huge win is, one, they're willing. The willingness to learn is like half the battle. And then comes the battle of, okay, how do we learn and how do we practice this? Yeah.
Yeah. And just like based on what you were saying, Saima, immediately a story like popped into my mind about my mom. My mom is, she was born and raised in Belize, and she came to the US when she was a teenager, early 20s. And I've noticed throughout growing up that one of the ways that my mom responds to stress, anxiety, overwhelm is to clean. I mean, how many of our moms don't do that, right? And so she cleans, and the cleaning functions as like a way to exercise some level of control, right? And so growing up and now in adulthood, it's like my siblings and I almost feel this urge to tell her not to, right? You don't have to clean as much. You can kind of take a break. You can have your rest, whatever, because we're thinking about her physical health, right? And so when we do that, for her, it's an immediate mismatch, right? Misattunement, because you're not understanding or recognizing or validating what cleaning does for me, how that allows me to reset and how that allows me to decompress when I'm feeling anxious and stressed. Because for us, that's not how we decompress. We don't pick up a broom and start sweeping, right? And so I think in saying that, it's like so important to be able to meet people where they're at, meet your parents where they're at, meet your children where they're at, so that you're not creating these expectations of them that they're not able to fulfill.
Of course. So like you guys mentioned, like the concept of empathy and compassion and having that for each other, because understanding that like everyone goes through things differently, everyone stress inducers are different, how they react to things are different. But to those that can't meet people in the middle, or if there is that disconnect that causes like a bunch of clash where you don't like, where like the example that you use for example, like how your mom is like, wait, that's how I experience stress and that's what helps me out. But like you understand that, and that's like a great like connection that you guys have. But to those who may not experience that, where there is that disconnect, that like, hey, like you can't meet that person in the middle, how could someone navigate through that experience?
So I think it goes back to the control we have as well, right? Like the control we have over this person's well-being, right? Like I know for Sumaiyah's example in particular, the children want her to maybe stop working so hard so her body's not so tired, right? So we have to look at, and then I understand you guys are being compassionate that, okay, this is what she needs for her to be able to decompress. So you guys are like, all right, let's let her do her thing, let's leave it behind. But then there are certain situations on the other side of the spectrum that are, maybe parents are self-sabotaging, maybe are doing things that are detrimental to their well-being in a larger sense. At that, and they may not be listening. So that's when we have to kind of ask ourselves, okay, what is within our control? Like, can we actually change this person's actions, or can we just hold space for them? Right? And can we, who will they listen to is another thing, right? Who is that trusted individual that they'll listen to? Because at the end of the day, we do kind of live, or I guess I could speak for myself and just what I see around me is there is a hierarchy in family systems, and the child is expected to listen to the parent. It doesn't really go vice versa. Majority of the time. So I think we have to understand where our control lies and understand in what ways they will actually listen and be receptive to what they're saying. That's the second step. And the third step is being able to take care of yourself, because if you see that your parent is self-sabotaging, that's obviously going to be very stressful to you as an individual. And then if you are stressed out, then it's likely that stress will add up, and that will result in an angry outburst potentially. And that angry outburst will not help the situation at hand. It'll only make it messier. So when we cannot control the person in front of us, we have to consider how can we control what we're feeling, because it is also what we are feeling. We may be scared. We may be uncertain. We may feel hopeless. We may feel powerless, right? It's all of these feelings that are manifesting this anxiety, or the anxiety, or vice versa, right? The anxiety is manifesting these feelings. So when we're feeling all of these things about this person, then we got to bring it back to, okay, I need to work through my own feelings, and then I can logically try to help this person as much as I can in the correct situation that I'll be able to be successful in helping them.
Of course. And when it comes to like finding ways to help ourselves in these moments of feeling like, okay, I'm not being like heard, as far as I'm only trying to help you out, like why aren't you understanding where I'm coming from? And if that still isn't being met, do you guys have any advice to anyone that might be going through that? Or is it something that like it's a personal experience that they're going through?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would do is I want to like acknowledge that hurt and acknowledge the pain, right? Because when you have a caregiver, I mean, this is like from an early age, your caregiver is the person that you look for for that emotional attachment, right? It's the person that you look towards for comfort, for safety, for stability, all of those things, right? And so when we're thinking about, and essentially what we're getting to is this like emotional capacity that may not be there, right, from the parents because of the ways that things have been passed down in their family and through their generation. Sometimes that emotional capacity, they just don't have it, right? And that can be very painful, and it is very painful, and it's hurtful because you expect it from them. And so when you're expecting it from them and they're not able to give it to you, again, it's like you're experiencing that clash. And so if there's a person who, you know, when you're thinking about advice for someone who's experiencing that on the regular, right? On the regular, they're experiencing this mismatch between them and their caregiver. I think to Saima's point, it's so important to work on that self-love and that self-compassion and patience and building that self-esteem within yourself to know that, okay, when my mom, my dad is not able to give me that kind of affection that I'm looking for, they're not able to give me the comfort that I'm looking for and that I need, I have the ability to self-soothe and work through some of these difficult emotions on my own. And that as you grow up, especially as an adult child, as you grow up, you're going to have to really foster that skill more and more, because there will be a time where even if your parents wanted to, they wouldn't be able to give it to you, right? Or they're just not available to give it to you. So working on that from an early age, being able to be a little bit more self-directed in your self-soothing process makes it a lot easier when a parent is not able to provide it for you. You don't feel like your world is kind of ending, right? And you can kind of turn to yourself, turn inward and say, okay, what do I need and what can I give myself to kind of give me that soothing that I wanted from them?
So trying to backtrack here a little bit, we've talked about this gap, like a very big elephant in the room. Could you guys define or talk about the gap that you guys experience in your own personal work between different generations, like older generations, younger generations, going through anxiety and how they respond to it?
Yeah, I think, again, it's going to be, in my head, there's personal experiences, right? And there's professional experiences, and oftentimes they align very well. And so when I think about the older generation, again, I'm thinking my parents, grandparents, or any clients that I've worked with that are around that age. Oftentimes the manifestations of anxiety, of stress, of overwhelm, it comes in two forms I see the most. One is almost like this reactive, outwardly projection of the stress that they're feeling, right? And then on the other side, it's the complete opposite, which is a lot of like withdrawing and isolation. And so an example of the first manifestation of that stress might be, you know, something that people experience, which is maybe some anger, right? Some anger. Some people experience arguing, things like that, a lot like high conflict, high tension households. That's some way that stress and overwhelm might manifest in a family dynamic. Another example of the one that is quite opposite, which is withdrawing, where you don't have the parents kind of being involved in the family. You know, they come home from work and they isolate immediately for whatever reason, right? It could be financial strain, right? It could be conflict at work. It could be just overwhelm they feel in general being outside of the home, and coming back, they just feel that need to withdraw. And so I've seen both sides of things, and what both sides end up doing is they do impact the younger people that are in the household, right? They're trying to figure out, how do I react when dad comes home, when mom comes home and they're super angry and activated? How do I react when I want to tell dad or mom a story and they're like, I don't have time for that right now, right? And so both feelings or both behaviors end up being very hurtful, or could be very hurtful and invalidating for the child that's in their home, because language is not really being used there, right? Language is not being used to explain, listen, you know, I had a hard day at work. Listen, this is kind of going on with me personally, you know, mentally. I don't have the capacity for it. They're not really saying that. They're not verbalizing that. And so the child is left to kind of guess, what did I do? is there something wrong with the family? What's wrong with my parents? How do we fix it? Right. And having all of those kind of questions, that those internal dialogues the child is having with themselves, leaves them just feeling, again, that sense of emotional neglect or misattunement, things like that, right? So when I think about the way that stress and anxiety and overall manifests in the older generations, I've literally seen both sides of the spectrum, but both have very, very similar consequences in a family dynamic.
Absolutely. And just to add a little bit to that is, I think a lot of the response in either generation goes back to the access to awareness, access to education that Sumaiyah was talking about earlier. Because if I look at, one side of the spectrum, which is the older generation, whether it be within my clients, whether it be in my own parents or just elders that I've seen, the response to anxiety or any emotion that that they don't like, I guess, that could be perceived as a negative emotion in society, the response is with a lot less compassion than what we see now, what we are taught now. It's almost like permission to emote. We have permission to emote. They did not have permission to emote. So that is a very clear distinction that I see, because the way a 65-year-old client will respond to anxiety would be, oh my God, I have anxiety. Like, how do I fix this problem? This is inconveniencing me to do what I need to do to continue providing, to continue being a part of society, versus, so they won't even, there will be some shame associated with it because it hasn't been a part of their narrative or hasn't been labeled as a part of their narrative for their entire life, versus I guess nowadays, not I guess I know, but nowadays there's a lot more awareness on terms such as anxiety or depression, etc., where a lot of people are using it to the point where it's become more of a buzzword, right? Where a lot of people are using it. There isn't as much shame associated with it. There is a lot more awareness and there's a lot more acceptance. So when there is awareness, there is acceptance, by default, there will be more compassion for others and also compassion for yourself, that, oh, I'm experiencing this and I deserve validation. I deserve to be heard. I want to be heard. But that wasn't really there, because that permission to emote, that permission to be compassionate towards themselves and show compassion wasn't really present. And if it's not present, then, we can't really expect it either. So that response can really vary when that permission isn't there.
Yeah. And that just really makes me think, I feel so deeply for both sides, right? For the younger generation and for the older generation, because for the younger, people, they have this permission, right? And they feel so much more comfortable for the most part, right? We don't want to make any generalizations, but for the most part, we're having these emotions in community as a collective, online or in person, whatever it is, where we're having these deep discussions about mental health, and it's very normal for us. So when you think that you have that safety to do so, and then you're met with someone from the older generation who's like, no, you can't. This makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about this. That can cause a lot of shame. It can, lead to a lot of invalidation or withdrawing some of the same things that you might see your parents do. And it kind of cuts off that safety and security that you've been building up amongst your friends, amongst your peers, amongst your siblings, whatever it might be. And then on the flip side, I feel for the older generation, because they see their kids and, younger people being able to emote so freely, right? And it looks probably so liberating. Yeah. But when you've grown up with 40 years of someone telling you that you're not allowed to cry, that you're not allowed to be angry, that you're only allowed to be happy and be obedient or whatever it is, it's you can't, it's not so easy to break that, right? You've grown up with those ideas. And so it makes me feel, I know oftentimes, again, for the younger people, it can feel so invalidating and so painful when their parents are not able to provide that for them. But I just feel so much for the parents as well, because who wouldn't want to be able to do that? But when people have told you that you're not allowed to, that's also very painful, right?
That's totally true. And I wanted to bring back the topic of language, because both of you guys have talked about language just previously. And the concept of language is so important, right? Like with language comes like an understanding, like you said, how parents might not know what anxiety is, but they might have heard the concept of restlessness or like feeling like off, but they don't know what it is. And it just might not just, but it could be anxiety, or the concept of language, like you brought up, Sumaiyah, how like just communicating with their kids about how you're feeling, but like you don't know how to communicate because you just haven't. Could you guys speak on how, like what you guys have seen in your experiences of what like the impact of language can have on like whether that's teaching like the older generation what anxiety is, and how it could be like something that's not as like a new concept that, but it might be for them, or like can you speak on those kinds of topics, for example?
Yeah, of course. I think there is, we have to kind of gauge the audience that we're speaking to, right? So like now we're talking about the older generation. I probably wouldn't start off by asking them, are you feeling anxious? Because it's possible that they don't even know what that means, right? So we may start off with asking them like, are you feeling restless? Are your thoughts racing? Are you sleeping at night? Are you worried excessively? Worried, restlessness, uncertainty. Do you feel like time is running out? Do you feel a brain fog? Like these are other terms that are really synonyms. They're symptoms, but also really synonymous to anxiety, the feeling of anxiety. So language does play a really big role. And although there's a large portion of our society that has accepted the existence of mental health issues, I still think it's an uphill battle. But although a large portion, alhamdulillah, has accepted it, we can't really speak to the older generations as if they've accepted it as well, right? We have to kind of beat around the bush a little bit, use terminology that they're okay with. Maybe they're not okay with being labeled as feeling anxious. Maybe they're not okay with being labeled as feeling depressed, because that may still correlate to quote unquote weakness for them. That may still correlate to lack of confidence for them. And we don't really want to tap into that energy yet, especially, and this goes back to like meeting people where they're at and being compassionate towards who we're dealing with here, with the generation that we're dealing with here. So it really, like, that's kind of like the different terms, I guess, that I tend to use with clients, or even with my own mother, really, just to help her understand that, hey, maybe you are struggling. Maybe your baseline has become anxious. Maybe your baseline maybe you don't have to feel this way all the time. Really, that's what it comes down to, is we can help you. Like, you don't have to feel this way all the time. I know this has been your normal for X amount of years, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. I also think, kind of jumping into that idea of like talking about symptoms, right? It's so much easier. I think also a lot of our parents, they're very much medical model, type understanding of things. So when you say, you talk about appetite, and you talk about sleep, and you talk about your heart racing, and you talk about things like that, these like physical manifestations of anxiety, they're like, yes, check, check, check. Like, I'm experiencing all of those things. But if you were to label that as, are you feeling anxious? They'd be like, no, right? And so when I'm thinking about, like, personally, definitely with my parents, I would definitely lean more into the physical side of things and really stay away from some of those other words, the mental health buzzwords that they might associate different meanings with it, even though it's essentially the same thing. So you want to make sure that when you're talking about these things, again, older generation talking to the younger generation and vice versa, that you're making these conversations be very accessible, right? You don't want it to go over anyone's head and make them feel even less included in the conversation, or make it feel more alienated to them, right? And so you want to use language that's accessible. You don't want to use anything that would confuse them further. And you just want to, again, meet them where they're at. Younger people these days, because of psychoeducation and access to things on the internet, we have the language to be able to describe what we're feeling. And sometimes the older generation just simply doesn't have it. That doesn't mean they're not experiencing pretty much the same thing. You just have to kind of tweak it a little bit so you're able to actually have a productive conversation about it.
I was just going to add a little tiny disclaimer here is, I do think, as we're trying to figure out how we can respond better to our parents' generation or grandparents' generation who have experienced anxiety, how we can respond to each other, this doesn't really mean that the younger generation has it all figured out in responding to our anxiety. So I think that's really important to note here, is that no one really has it figured out. I think as we're talking about how we can respond to theirs and how they respond to their own and how we can respond to theirs, I think it's also important for us to address how do we respond to anxiety and how can we better respond to our own, really, as a younger generation, because there's room for growth in both areas.
I think there's a lot of, like we have mentioned previously, is the concept of compassion and empathy. And sometimes we just have to reflect on ourselves and how the other person, what they might be going through, and how the different generations truly, it does impact how we react to our anxiety and what even causes our anxiousness. So now that we've talked about how older generations react to anxiety, could you guys speak upon how younger generations respond to anxiety, to see the differences in that?
I think that in my experience, I've also seen it from two different sides or two different manifestations of it. And it's not limited to that, right? But the first would be something that's a little bit more outward, right? The outward manifestations of anxiety, which happens mostly that I've seen where people kind of seek a lot of reassurance and comfort from other people when they're kind of having this highly anxious inner dialogue, right? Am I okay? Am I doing this right? Someone needs to help me, guide me. Like, I need more support. I can't do this alone. Things like that, right? And that really is just wanting to soothe some of that inner dialogue that's kind of going on and hoping that someone else can kind of do that for you, or someone else can support you in that process, which again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but that's just typically what I see. Because again, with young people, there's a lot of reliance on support system, caregiver, family, whoever it is. And some of that reliance comes in the form of, how are you going to soothe me as I'm experiencing this level of anxiety, right? On the other hand, I also see some withdrawing, some of the same type of withdrawing that I might see in the older generation, where you're having these racing thoughts. And oftentimes those thoughts are characterized by, inner critic, highly anxious, a lot of self-doubt, things like that, right? Again, it's the idea that I'm not doing this right. What if this happens? This could go wrong, whatever it is, but it's happening internally. And then the person just feels the need to withdraw from, family, friends, whatever it is, until those thoughts kind of die down. And so I think seeing those two reactions personally and professionally, I can also see the way that they align very much with the older generation, but it's especially with the one where you're withdrawing. I mean, how are you going to kind of meet each other when both parties are withdrawing and doesn't really want to come together to talk about it, right? So that is a little bit difficult. And I think oftentimes it's a learned behavior. If you notice that when mom and dad are upset, they kind of go to their rooms and they don't come out for dinner and they don't want to engage with you, you learn, okay, if I'm upset, if I'm mad, if I'm sad, if I'm anxious, I should just go to my room and wait for it to pass. And you don't really get that opportunity to hash it out or, have a productive conversation with your parents.
No, thank you for sharing that, Sumaiyah. I think you brought up a lot of good points about how the younger generation responds to anxiety, right? And how there is a lot of overlap. And I think that's very important to address, because when we're talking about different generations, a lot of times it's like, oh, this generation does this very different thing, and then this generation does a very different thing. It's not yes, we come from two very different times, or three very different times, depending on, where you fall. But there's a lot of overlap because family culture plays a really big role. Environment plays a really big role. And traditions and culture and all that stuff play a really big role in how we respond to anything, really. But in this particular scenario, how we respond to anxiety. The one distinction that I will mention, though, is it's an environmental distinction. Is anxiety is what? Like a fear of uncertainty, right? Fear of the future is when a lot of that worry kicks in. A lot of that of so-called anxiety, again, that restlessness, all those symptoms that we address, that's when they kick in, when we're thinking about the future, when we're overthinking, when we're ruminating, when we're fixating. It's a lot of the unknown, the fear of the unknown. So I think nowadays there is a large emphasis on instant gratification, right? So anxiety isn't really the way we perceive it, the way we respond to it is in a very hasty way, where it's like, I'm feeling anxious, I need to find like a solution to this. And I can find a solution to this because there's so many resources. There's resources, there's access to people, there is information online. There are therapists readily available now, a lot more. There can be instant gratification versus, I think when we were talking about the older generation, that wasn't really necessarily an option to be instantly gratified, to actually comfort and feed your uncertainty wasn't really an option. So I think that's a pretty clear distinction between the two responses, is that they didn't have permission to respond, and we kind of have permission to respond because there are ways to ease those feelings, to ease those emotions. Although we both may still be withdrawing, we may be dissociating, we may be having heart palpitations, sweaty palms, all those things are happening to everyone. But one group of people may feel like they need to be avoidant, and another group of people may feel like, I'm going to search up ways to manage this and apply it. Which, that in itself could be a double-edged sword, because it's like when you don't find the answers, then that actually amplifies anxiety, and that's, it's a cycle.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think the concept of like having that overlap is really interesting, because it makes you think that, okay, we're not as different. Like there's like a common ground when it comes to that, and it can bridge that like gap a lot more with that understanding of compassion, and like, I'm going through it, they're going through it a certain way, they might react differently, but that doesn't take their hurt or their anxiousness like away either. So that understanding is really like important. So now that we know what the gaps are, I wanted to pose a question on how we can address it, and how do we address it, whether that's like talking and having this conversation with our parents, if there is a disconnect, if there isn't, like just how do we address it in general?
Yeah, I think that, I'm always an advocate for just being able to have a conversation, right? Being able to use language that's accessible to both parties and finding safety in that. I think that that's something, though, that I would definitely lead with is it safe to do so, right? For a child that has highly reactive parents, searching for that safety to be able to have a conversation, wanting to bridge this gap with their parents, and so coming to them with that intention, I would almost encourage a person like that to kind of pause and say, what are you kind of hoping to get out of this, right? And if the answer to that question is, I want my parents to understand me, I want them to validate me, to acknowledge my hurt, to acknowledge ways I've been misunderstood by them. But there's also history to back up the fact that your parents haven't been able to provide that for you, right? Because of a lot of different reasons, right? But they just haven't been able to provide that for you. Then taking that pause and saying, can my parents give me what I want in this moment? Or vice versa, a parent saying, can my child give me what I need in this moment? Give me the space that I need in this moment to have this reactive moment to stress and overwhelmed. If the answer is no, they can't give me that, then you have to kind of get creative about other ways you can get that need met. And oftentimes it's either turning to yourself and giving yourself that like regulation that you're searching for, or it's again turning to more trusted individuals within your support system, friends, other family members, siblings, a trusted adult, maybe a parent who is a little bit more receptive to that. Sometimes it can't be both parents, but it's one or the other, whatever the situation is, and kind of leaning on those protective people and those protective factors in your life instead of constantly trying to get those needs met by people or a person who hasn't been able to provide it to you in the past.
Alongside that compassion, consideration for who we're wanting to have this conversation with, we have to acknowledge that this is a very situational thing, right? In some people's situation, a conversation is a likely scenario. In other people's situation, a conversation is not a likely scenario. And when we have a situation like that, it's important to ask yourself, how can I navigate through this environment through what is in my control? Right? How do I serve? Maybe it's an abusive environment, right? So in that case, how do I survive within this environment? What do I need to do to make sure I'm okay? Because if my anxiety levels are already amplified, and then I'm trying to have this conversation in a very dysregulated state of mind, that's only going to increase or even amplify my anxiety levels even more. And then that will dysregulate me even more. And then it's not really helping anybody in the situation. So it is a very situational thing. So, which is why that first question we need to ask ourselves is, what am I hoping to get out of it? What am and is the person in front of me willing to listen? And if they're not willing to listen, then there are other ways to navigate. Then we bring that control back into our own hands. Although a lot of these situations may feel powerless, there's always some amount of power that we hold over the situation. And that's very important to recognize. And that's that's a good place to begin. I would hope that makes us all feel hopeful is that even though we're not able to mend the situation, we can always work on things within ourselves. Even if we are the ones putting in more work, at least we're getting somewhere.
Thank you guys so much for sharing. The concept of family dynamics, intergenerational anxiety, it's very personal. It's very situational, like you said. And the concept of the needs that older generations need and younger generations need are just so different, but also there is an overlap, like you guys have mentioned. So there's no perfect way to respond to things. It's not a black and white situation. So to end off, do you guys have any last minute thoughts, like any thoughts that you guys have regarding this topic?
Yeah, I do. I think that it's so important we're talking about families, right? This whole conversation, we've been talking about families, and it's such a difficult and heavy topic, right? Your family is, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of emotions associated with family dynamics and with parents and with children. And so it's very important for me to kind of leave this conversation knowing that every family is different. Every family dynamic is complex and in their own right. And so when we're doing a lot of comparing, this parent is able to treat their child this way. Why can't mine do it for me? This child is perfect. He gets straight A's and he's, whatever. Why can't my child give me the same, right? That comparison, it can really tarnish some of that affection and love and connection that is supposed to be within a family dynamic, right? And so I think that it's very important for you to just acknowledge that your parents are, who they are where they're at. Your children are who they are, and they are where they're at in life. And so the meeting each other where they're at and accepting people for who they are as they are today is so important, so that you don't idealize a family dynamic that really doesn't exist, right? And again, doing that work to kind of turn inward and doing that self-soothing and that the regulating to be able to provide yourself some of that safety and compassion and comfort that you might be looking for in times of anxiousness.
Yeah, and I guess just kind of I would want to end off and bringing back the concept of intergenerational anxiety, right? Where I think the people that are, us that are sitting here, and maybe some of those people that are going to be listening to this podcast are either considering or trying to be those cycle breakers. They're recognizing that this is a concept. That's why they may be curious to learn and want to learn about intergenerational anxiety or any other kind of mental health issue that is being passed down from generation to generation, is alongside everything that we've discussed when it comes to locus of control, when it comes to navigating through different family dynamics, how different everyone's dynamics are, older generation, younger generation, change, all of those things. It's important to recognize that when we are trying to break a cycle, it's going to take time. One, it's going to take healing. And that healing will not really occur until we acknowledge what the problem is, until we until we increase self-awareness and maybe make others aware as well. And then we accept what the reality of the issue is. And every family's reality will be different. Intergenerational anxiety will look different in every family. I know I started off this episode with one particular example, but every family's example of intergenerational anxiety will look different. And if we are wanting to take action, if we are wanting to address and bring change, let's say, in a tangible way, then we can, those conversations can be had. They're going to be anxiety inducing conversations, but there are ways we can push through that anxiety. We can learn to cope with our own anxiety and then push through that anxiety of having that conversation. And honestly, the anxious mind is a very powerful being, really. It has a mind of its own, is what I say to my clients a lot of times. It has a mind of its own. It will convince us of the craziest things. And before we act, we have to get our anxious mind in control. We have to grab the reins of it, right? We have to keep it in control. We have to self-regulate, and we have to ground ourselves so that logic brain is turning off. Because when we're feeling anxious, our logic brain turns off and we're not thinking clearly. So when we bring our anxiety levels down and our logic brain opens up again, that's when we're thinking rationally. So it is, a lot of this work is internal work. A lot of times when we're talking about families, it becomes, okay, what can we change as a family? That becomes a first step. That's the first step we talk about. But the first step is always going to be, what can I change within myself? And then how can I bring that to my family? And then, the outcome can vary depending on everything we've addressed before.
Wow, thank you guys so much for sharing. Like we said, we do have a part 1 to this two-part anxious inside the anxious mind episode. So please check that out if you guys want to get like a clinical, more in-depth side of what anxiety can look like. And thank you guys so much for hopping on this episode. It's always a pleasure. And so inshallah, see you guys next time.